Wednesday class. Man, I've been missing y'all so much. It's like I went off to Costa Rica, came home, and we went out on Exodus or something. Seriously, I've been missing y'all. I'm looking forward to getting back with y'all. Dave has been doing a great job on the video messages for Exodus up to Exodus 10, which is where I'm going to pick up here in a few minutes. And you may wonder what I'm doing right now. Well, with the social distancing and considering we're in Exodus, I'm going on an Exodus myself. I'm not sure where I'm going to end up filming this yet, but we'll find out here in just a few minutes. I'm looking forward to this class. It's different doing it on video, but I hope you enjoy it. I'll see y'all soon. Enjoy Exodus 11 through 13 and the Passover. Hello, Wednesday night class. Welcome to the study. I apologize for the way I look. I'm kind of sweaty, a little disheveled. To get to where I'm at, there's a story behind it, and when we come together physically in the same room, I'll tell you the story. But for our Exodus lesson tonight, I brought you out on Exodus. And where we're learning from tonight is in Exodus 11 through 13:16. Dave has done a good job bringing us up to this point, and it has been some great lessons. So I'm going to start with a little prayer, and then we'll get straight into the lesson. Father, I want to thank you for the ability to come together as a group. Even though we are separate physically, spiritually, we are still all together. We are all together in your church. I ask that you use me to teach this lesson despite the circumstances, and just let me bring all the glory to you in this story of the Exodus and the Passover. Just fill us with your Son tonight. That's all I can ask. And I ask this in your precious Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, so like I said, I apologize for my looks, but let's get on with the lesson. Tonight we're going to start, Dave taught through 10, and I'm supposed to pick up in 11, but I'm going to back up a little bit and do the last couple of verses of 10 to bring us into some context of chapter 11. So, chapter 10, verses 27 through 29 say, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him, 'Get away from me. Take heed to yourself, and see my face no more. For in the day you see my face, you shall die.' So Moses said, 'You have spoken well. I will never see your face again.'" So Pharaoh had this meeting with Moses, and they had this conversation, and Pharaoh told him to leave, never see his face again, or he would die. So when we pick up in chapter 11, it's going to sound like a different meeting, but chapter 11 is actually three different parts. Verses 1 through 3 actually happened before the meeting with Pharaoh. Verses 4 through 8 happened during the meeting with Pharaoh, and verses 9 and 10 are after the meeting with Pharaoh. So we're going to see three different sections as we step through chapter 11. Chapter 11 is only 10 verses long, but let's step right into it. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. "And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterwards, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor, articles of silver and articles of gold. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people." Okay, so the Israelites were told, you're going to be driven out. They're going to let you go. but I want you to ask for silver and gold and items of clothing. They'd been oppressed and slaves, and now they're asking their slave masters for gold and silver. What master is going to give somebody gold and silver? Well, if we look in verse 3, it says that God himself is going to give them favor in the eyes of the people, and also Moses was seen as great. So God is going to put it in the hearts of the Egyptians to give gold and silver to all of the Israelites. So now let's step on into verses 4 through 8 in Exodus 11. Then Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn animals. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as not like it before, nor shall be like it again. But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue, against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down before me, saying, Get out, and all the people who follow you. After that I will go out." Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. Okay, so verses 4 through 8, this is in the meeting with Pharaoh. Okay, we saw what God told Moses before, and now this is what Moses is telling to Pharaoh. He explains that the plague is coming, that all the firstborn are going to die. And we have to remember, this is not a plague just on children. I've had it in my mind for years that it was just, the firstborn children. But this is anybody, any male that, we find out later, any male that was firstborn dies. So you could be a grandfather. If you were the firstborn of your father, then you were going to die. The firstborn of all the animals. And then Moses says there's going to be this great cry throughout Egypt. And a great cry like never before, and a great cry like never will happen again. So they've had this meeting, and then Moses leaves in anger. He left in great anger, it says. So after that, we move into verses 9 and 10 that say, "But the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt." So Moses and Aaron did all of these wonders before Pharaoh. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land. So God tells Moses that once again, Pharaoh's not going to let them go, but there's a reason to it. It's so that God can show his wonders throughout the land. And then it says that Aaron and Moses did all that. That's kind of a wrap up of all the plagues up to this point. They did all these signs and wonders leading up to now. And so now we step into the heart of tonight's lesson, chapter 12. First, we're going to read verses 1 through 2 in chapter 12. "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Now, God starts the Passover, starts all of this with changing the whole Jewish calendar. Basically, he moved the Jewish calendars 6 months ahead. Up to this point, the Jews had been using the same calendar as the Egyptians. Their first month began in what was called the month of Tishri. It was in the autumn, in the fall. Their calendar is done by the lunar, so that when the moon is in certain phases, that's when it begins. It's not a set date like ours is. So sometime in the autumn would be the month of Tishri, and that was the first year for the Jewish people. So God now is moving it to the month of Aviv, which means fresh young ears, early spring when the wheat starts budding, Aviv. You may also hear the month called Nisan. What happened is the Jewish people called it Aviv. When they were taken into the Babylonian captivity, they started using the word Nisan, which is the same month, just in the Babylonian language. So if you hear Aviv or Nisan, the King James, New King James has Abib, A-B-I-B. It's all the same month. And it happens in early spring. And just as a side note, the Jewish people, the Israelites, believe that they've counted every year since Adam. And if you're watching this video on Wednesday night, this is Passover, April 8th of 2020, then tonight is actually 14 Nisan 5780, according to the Jewish calendar. So why did God change the Jewish calendar? Simply, he was trying to set the Israelites completely apart from the Egyptians. So he's bringing them out of the land. He's done these plagues. He said he was going to have a difference between the Egyptians and the Israelites, and now he's even changing their calendar. So let's step forward now into verses 3 through 6. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. Okay, so this is where we see the beginning steps of Passover. The Lord tells Moses each person is to take a lamb into their father's house, into the household, on the 10th day of Aviv, or Nisan. Then it's supposed to be one for each family. The family's not large enough, then we bring in more people, get several households together for a single lamb. This shows us that Passover was supposed to be this great, sorry, I'm looking for the word here, corporate event. They were supposed to be a group of people corporately together remembering the Passover. So if your household didn't have enough people in it, you were to bring in more people. The lamb then would be kept for 4 days, from the 10th to the 14th, and it would be sacrificed at twilight. Now the word twilight in the Jewish calendar actually translates to between the evenings. Most of the Jewish writers would say that the national lamb was slain at 3 p.m. because that would be halfway between what they considered the two evenings. And that actually becomes important later when we look at how the Passover relates to Christ and how it's a typology of Christ. So let's move on to verses 7 through 14. Says, and they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. They shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. All right, we see they're supposed to take some of the blood of the sacrifice, and we find out later they use a hyssop branch and they splatter it on the doorsteps or on the doorpost and on the lintel. And the lintel is the piece that goes across the top. And notice it says that this is a sign. The sign is for God to see. It's the blood of the animal is not what saved the people. It was their faith that what God said for them to do was going to save them. The blood was just a sign of that faith. We see in Hebrews 11:28 that the writer of Hebrews says, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Okay, notice that it was a sign. The blood of that sacrificial lamb did not save the people. It was their faith that what God told them to do was what saved them. Then we also see there to eat it with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. This was not meant to be a really enjoyable meal. The meal was meant as a reminder of things, and it was supposed to have the bitter taste in the mouth and leave that bitterness for a little bit so they could remember things. Then the meal was to be eaten in haste, like they were getting ready to run out the door. It says with a belt on their waist. The King James says with their girded, where they would pull the long robes up, put the belt on to tie it up so that they could move their feet real fast and it wouldn't get in the way. With their staff in their hands. So they were to eat this meal ready just to run out the door and be gone. And God says this remembrance will be for everlasting. So let's move on to verses 15 through 20. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Whether he is a stranger or a native of the land, you shall eat nothing leavened. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwellings. You shall eat unleavened bread. Okay. This can get confusing, so I'm going to put a little thing up here for you to look at, a little calendar that runs from the 14th to the 21st. This is separate but attached to the Passover. This is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Through history, they've kind of been pushed together so that some people, when they say Passover, they mean the entire 8 days. But we see here, originally Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were 2 different days. If you'll look, the 14th of Nisan is Passover. We see it in verses 7 through 14 and verse 18 here. Then the first day, which is where all the leaven is supposed to be removed, is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That would be on the 15th. Then we go through to the 21st, which is the seventh day. That day is the last day. Now, the 14th Passover day is a Sabbath. The 15th, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is a Sabbath, a holy convocation. Then the last day, the 21st, is also a Sabbath. So it can get a little confusing in there, and I hope this little thing I've put up there for you helps. So let's move on into verses 21 through 28. In verse 21, it says, Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your family, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of the house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be, when your children say to you, What do you mean by this service? That you shall say, It is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered your households. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the children of Israel went away and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. Okay, so up to this point, we've heard God talking to Moses and explaining the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Here we see Moses taking what he was told and moving forward and telling it to the Israelite people. He explains everything that God told him to do, and he told them now is the time to gather the lambs in and get ready. And then he says, remember, this is a reminder. This day will be kept throughout your generations. And you're supposed to tell the generations the reason we're doing this is to tell what God did for the Israelite people. All right, so we move forward into Exodus 29:30. It says, And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in the city, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. So now we finally see the 10th plague happen. The Lord passed through, and every firstborn died, from the greatest to the least, and even the beast. It was for everybody. And he says that there wasn't a house left where somebody didn't die. God had planned it out to where every single household in Egypt had somebody die. And then in verses 31 through 36, we see, Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste. For they said, We shall all be dead. For the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given people in the favor in the sight of Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So we see here that Pharaoh tells him, that Pharaoh called and said, Moses and Aaron, take everything and just leave. Get out of my sight, leave my people, go. Notice there's no meeting. He called for him. Basically, he sent message to him, said, just get out, go. Take everything, all your flocks and everything, and go with you. And we see that the Israelites had done exactly what God had told them to do. They asked for gold and silver and articles of clothing, and the people had given it to them. And God says that they plundered Egypt that way. They took their gold, their silver, they plundered Egypt. Later, that gold and silver was used to build the tabernacle. That's how they furnished and supplied everything for the tabernacle, was all of this gold, silver, and wealth that they had taken. So, let's move on to verses 37 and 39. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. All right. It says there was 600,000 men besides children. Well, that was also besides children and women. Most experts agree that there was probably somewhere around 2 million Israelites that left that day. It also says there was a mixed multitude that went with them. So there could have been, 2 to 3 million people marching out of Egypt at the time. That mixed multitude was probably visitors in the land, other peoples that lived there, and they saw that the Israelites had plundered Egypt, taken all this wealth, and were leaving, and so they decided to go with the Israelites and leave at the same time. Then we see that they did not, the bread was unleavened. They didn't have time to leaven it, just like the Lord said there'd be no leaven. They baked these cakes after they had got out. And so basically they were eating what we would call crackers, that crispy, unleavened, unrised bread. So let's move on to verses 40 through 42. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. Okay, this 430 years. This is one of the places where some of the people that want to discount the Bible say that there's a controversy. Let's look at a few of verses that talk about these years, and we'll see there's a 430-year time window and a 400-year time window, and we'll bring those together and show how they come together. Genesis 15:13 says, Then he said to Abram, Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. So we see this one says that they would be 400 years afflicted, where in Exodus it says 430. Also in Acts 7:6 we see, But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. There it is again, 400 years. So now in Genesis and Acts, we see 400 years. In Exodus, it's 430, and in Galatians 3:17, Paul says, And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before God in Christ, that it should make the promise of no effect. Okay, so now in two places we have 400 years, and in two places we have 430 years. So if you look at this chart, it shows how the differences are spoken of. The 430 years is from the promise to Abram and when he leaves Haran. The 400 years is from when Isaac is weaned and he's mocked, persecuted by Ishmael. From that point to the point in Exodus is 400 years. So it's when the promise began. One was 430 years, one was 400 years, and we see they both line up on that day, on the 15th of Nisan in the Exodus. So let's move forward and into 43 through 51. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, they may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. In one house it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside of the house. Now shall you break one of the bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born, and one for the stranger who dwells among you." Thus all the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass on that very same day that the Lord brought all the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt according to their armies. Okay, so this kind of recaps and tells the rules for the Passover. You have to be a Jew to participate in the Passover. If you are a sojourner in the land, if you are a slave, you could participate, but first you had to be circumcised and you had to become a Jew. Then you were welcome to participate. It said the meal had to be taken inside of the house, and each person that's a Jew themselves individually have to partake of that meal. And then it says that everything came to pass just as God said it would do. So that's chapter 12. Now we'll move into chapter 13 and we'll do verses 1 through 16. And we're just going to start with verses 1 through 2. God says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine." Okay, so verses 1 and 2, God claims all of the firstborn. Now he's going to explain something different for a few minutes, or for a few verses, and then he's going to come back to this rule of the firstborn. So just for the second, just know that God has claimed all of the firstborn. So now we're going to look at verses 3 through 10. "And Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you are going out in the month of Abib, and it shall be, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, This is done because of what the Lord did for me. I came up from Egypt. It shall be a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. Okay, so this is a reiterance of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is just God reiterating, this is what I want done. This is how you're supposed to do it. And it's just for the generations. And the reason for it is for you when you're doing this and your sons and daughters ask why, you're to tell them because God's mighty hand brought us out of Egypt beginning on this day, that 15th day of Nisan. And then just a little side note here, you know I love my little rabbit hole chases. In verse 9 it says, it shall be as a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes. Have you ever heard of the word phylacteries? Well, this is where that comes from. The word phylactery or tefillin is the Jewish word for it. It's a little box. And this box, the Jews took these verses as literal. And so they would write scripture and put them in these little boxes and tie the box on their arm and on their forehead between their eyes. And they would pray with these items on them. Those were phylacteries. So just an interesting fact, that's where the word phylactery comes from. So let's move into the last verses of the evening. It'll be verses 11 through 16. And it says, and it shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, that you shall set apart to the Lord all that opens the womb. That is, every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have, the male shall be the Lord's. But every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. And if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And all the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. So it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? That you shall say to him, by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And it came to pass when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be a sign on your hand and as the frontlets between your eyes, for by strength of the hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So this is what they refer to as the law of the firstborn. The firstborn male of anything belongs to God. It's his. How we treat it depends on what that firstborn is. If it's a firstborn person, male son, then we're to redeem, they were to redeem that. They were to take a sacrifice to the temple and sacrifice an animal in place of the person to redeem them. We even see in the New Testament where Mary and Joseph did this for Christ. They took, I'm sorry I don't have it right on hand, but I believe it was 2 doves or 2 pigeons, which was the poor man's way of redeeming a child. Donkeys, work animals, they were valuable. So you were able to either redeem the animal, and if you didn't redeem the animal, then you had to sacrifice the animal by breaking its neck. And so the firstborn of all lambs, they were sacrificed, and whatever the firstborn male was sacrificed. And the reason for this also is for a reminder for the generations. All right, that's officially the lesson for this evening, Exodus 11 through 13, 16. But what I want to do now, since tonight is the Passover, I wanted to do a little quick thing in typology. What typology is it shows how things in the Old Testament were pictures or types of things in the New Testament, especially Christ. How things in the Old Testament pictured Christ, or how Christ fulfilled things in the Old Testament, and not just Christ, but how some of what we go through were also pictured in this. And so I wanted to do it just specifically tonight for the Passover and for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Some of these you may have heard before. I hope I will show some that you've never heard before, because I know there were some in here I'd never seen before. So I'm going to take a sip of my Dr. Pepper, and then I'm going to step through this. Okay. So we know that Jesus is often referred to as the Lamb. We've all heard of the Passover Lamb. And we see that Jesus is referred to as the Lamb, or the Lamb of God, in John 1:29, John 1:36, 1 Peter 1:19. And in Revelation, he's referred to as the Lamb 28 times. So there's no doubt that Jesus is the Lamb of God. But he's also called our Passover. Not the Passover Lamb, he's called the Passover. In 1 Corinthians 5:7, Paul says, "Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us." Okay, so we see that Christ is not only the Passover Lamb, he is the Passover. So let's take a look at a few ways that all of this comes together. First, it was a male, it was a lamb or a goat, but it was a male 1 year old. 1 year old lambs were considered adults in the prime of their life. That would be a prime of their life. Christ was an adult male in the prime of his life. Had to be without blemish. And remember, blemish meant no physical blemish or health blemish or spiritual blemish. Without blemish. And we see that Christ was without sin. He was sinless. 1 Peter 2:22 says, "Who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth." And then Hebrews 4:15, the writer says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin." So he was an adult male in the prime of his life, and he was without blemish. Then we see that on the 10th of Aviv, when the lamb was to be brought into the Father's house, on the 10th of Aviv, Palm Sunday, Christ entered into Jerusalem and then went straight to the temple, his Father's house. So he went from outside, he came in on the 10th of Aviv, the same day they were to take the lambs in, to his Father's house. And then for the next 4 days, Christ was questioned and inspected for falsehoods, blemishes. We see that he was tested by the Pharisees, by the Sadducees, by the Herodians, and even Pilate. And then Pilate says in Luke 23:4, "I can find no fault with him." So we see that he was without blemish. He was tested for the 4 days. And then, by the way, these are in no order. These are just as they come. Jesus died, we're told in Mark, at 3 p.m. At that same time that the national Passover lamb was being sacrificed is the same time that Christ died on the cross. Jesus was sacrificed whole, just like the lamb could not be broken or put into pots, because the pots back then, not every family would have one big enough to fit a whole lamb in, so they couldn't break it and put. That's why it had to be roasted whole. Christ was sacrificed whole for us. The blood of the lamb was sprinkled with hyssop. Christ's lips, they tried to sprinkle his lips with vinegar with hyssop. Nothing of the Passover lamb could be left in till morning. Christ was taken off of the cross before the next day, which was very unusual for the Romans. Usually the Romans, when they crucified someone, they left them hanging for days. They wanted everybody to have that as a warning. Now, don't mess with the Romans. They'll put you on a cross and leave you for days. But that didn't happen with Christ. He was removed from that and was not left until the morning. When God looked down and saw the blood of the sacrifice on the post and the lintel, he saw the blood and passed over the house. When he looks at a believer, he sees Christ's blood on me. He doesn't see me, he sees Christ's blood, and I'm withheld from that part of judgment. Christ was a perfect representative of humanity for the sacrifice. Just like Adam was the representative for us for the fall, Christ was that perfect representative for the sacrifice. Christ was the firstborn male. He was sacrificed for us. He was the first begotten Son and only begotten Son. Then we saw that each person individually had to partake of the Passover lamb. We each individually have to partake of what Christ has done for us. It's an individual thing that we each have to take in, and then we come in corporately as the church. So it's an individual partaking in a corporate manner. Passover represents Israel's release from slavery. Christ's death on the cross, his sacrifice, represents our release from the slavery of sin. He is the Passover, that release from slavery. And then we see the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now remember, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was a Sabbath. No work to be done. On that day, that first day is like our first day. Our first day of believers, we do no work. All the work was done by God. We rest in that work on that Sabbath of what he's done. That is our salvation. Then for the next 5 days in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they were to remove all sin, or all leaven, representing sin, all leaven from the house. They had to work to make sure none was left in the house. And that is our sanctification. That is our work. That's what we do for the 5 days in between. It represents our sanctification. Then on the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that is also a Sabbath where we rest in what God has done. That's the final act of redemption for us. That's what we call glorification. That's when we physically, our bodies pass away and we are instantly with the Lord. So we see in that Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first day we rest in God's work and the last day we rest in God's work. But in between, we are called to work. And then finally, we see that Christ himself is our unleavened bread. The wind has finally picked up this afternoon, so I'm going to hold this right here just a second. Okay, Christ is our unleavened bread. In Luke 22:19 we see, and he took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So, I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I hope you've enjoyed the view behind me instead of an old classroom. I've enjoyed bringing this message to you. And remember, when we get back together, to ask why I was so sweaty and if I actually ever got out of here. I look forward to seeing you all again. I'm going to give thanks for today, and the lesson will end. Lord Father, I want to thank you for this. Thank you for the blessing that you've given me going over this. Thank you for the days that we have. Thank you for our first day, our salvation, and our last day, our glorification. And please help us each to pass through on those other 5 days, making ourselves better, bringing the sin out of us. And then allow us on that last day just to rest in your precious Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.